Hey, welcome back to the Saretsky Show. As always, I'm going to put together a special video this week. A lot of you, we have the BC elections here where I am in Vancouver, British Columbia. We got a very important provincial election. In fact, a lot of you that are listening to this video today are probably going to go to the polls this weekend, the advanced voting. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to cover the NDP and the Conservative, it's a two-horse race. I wanted to cover both of their housing platforms in detail. And I wanted to cover some of the economics behind it, some of the realities of some of that, myself is in the trenches day to day. I know how the housing market works. I know how it functions. I know these things. It's my job to know them. So I'm going to basically give you my honest opinion of each party's platforms, particularly around housing, some of it around economics. Just brief about myself. I've spoken with all levels of government, of all different political stripes over the last number of years. Okay, I consider myself personally center right. That's who I am as a guy that likes economics and macroeconomics, and runs his own business, works for himself. Yes, I tend to be center right. I believe in the free market, the private sector. That I believe is the most efficient allocator of capital. So that's my personal political views. But again, I voted for all parties. I'll give you context here. Why I might consider myself center right. I think at times you need change. At times, I felt back when we had Christy Clark for 16 years, we needed a change. I decided to vote against her. Back when it was, I think it was 2017, I believe it was. And so, I do my best to keep things objective. I'm willing to sort of keep an open mind and to ultimately try to vote for what I think is going to move this province or this country forward in a better light. And so I'll do my best here to keep it as objective as possible. But, keep in mind, everybody's got their own opinions and they might agree with me. You might disagree with me. Everyone's got their own political views. Everyone, I think, in my opinion, people tend to vote for what is the best outcome for themselves, right? A young person might vote for something different than an old boomer that has a $5 million house. And so everybody has some bias to some extent, and everyone tends to look out for their own best interests. But again, I will do my best to remove myself from this and provide you guys my honest opinion. Now, again, if we simply look at the two housing party platforms, I would summarize them as such. The Conservative Party is more, hey, let's let the private sector do its thing. Let's take government out of the picture as much as possible. If we can kind of step out of the way, the private sector can kind of step in, fill the void, do what it does best. Whereas you have the NDP, which is more command and control. We're going to tell everybody what to do. We think we know the problem best, and this is exactly what you're going to do. If you like it, great. If you don't, too bad. So this is kind of the views around the housing platforms in general. Now, if we go on to, I'm going to go through both parties' websites and read it line by line on all of their policies, at least the big ones, to sort of help you, again, hopefully distill this information so at least you can go to the polls and make an educated vote, at least around sort of housing. And so if we look at the BC Conservative, first and foremost, they're promising the Rustad Rebate, which is we're going to allow you to deduct your rent and or your mortgage against your BC income taxes up to $3,000 a month, starting, I believe, in 2026. If you actually kind of run the numbers on this and what that actually means, it's going to work out to, for most people, it's going to work out to about $500, $600, $700 a year in tax savings. So pretty minimal. But again, it sells politically. Hey, listen, we're going to let you deduct your mortgage interest cost and your rent against your taxes. So that's their way, their opinion of saying, hey, we're going to save you money. Not a bad policy, I suppose, in an era where the cost of living is crushing people ultimately. The big thing they're doing though is around zoning. They basically want to say, hey, listen, we've got this mandate where it should be 6 months for a rezoning and development permit, and it should be 3 months for a building permit. If there's not a clear yes or no from the city, because cities control these permits, then the province will step in and issue the permits. Again, I'm not necessarily sure around the semantics of that. Hopefully they actually stick to that. I mean, I think it's hard necessarily to give a yes or no. Municipalities tend to really drag their feet on a lot of this stuff. Sometimes there's environmental stuff that gets in the way, et cetera, et cetera. They've also talked about they're going to trust BC professionals to do the job, so critical months and years are wasted by having bureaucracy second-guess the work of highly skilled, regulated, certified technical professionals like engineers and architects. Will enact the presumption of compliance laws, and municipal and provincial regulators must presume that BC professionals can perform peer review their accords within the rules. No, that one's just, in my opinion, more so gibberish. What the big one here is they've got the BC Building Code. They want to dial that back. So the BC Building Code is basically you have to build housing to a specific requirement, particularly around environmental. So there's environmental requirements that you need to hit when you build new housing. And so we have in Step Code 3 predominantly, and sometimes Step Code 4 here in BC. You've also got net zero mandates that are increasing as well in some of these municipalities. And so basically what that does is, like, if you have to think about it, if you have to create a more environmentally friendly building, that's just typically a more expensive process, right? If you have to have an airtight building envelope, if you have to have triple pane windows, that's much more expensive than building double pane windows. And so the BC Building Code, particularly around the environmental stuff, definitely adds a significant amount to cost. And so I'd always laugh, right? Because we can't have two things. People always think, well, we need to care about the environment, but we also need affordable housing. No, those two actually don't really go hand in hand, truthfully. And so I think by scaling back the BC Building Code will reduce construction costs, and construction costs are a huge problem today. So I think that's generally speaking is really good policy. I think some of the other stuff they've talked about is Bill 47. So that's what the BC NDP initially brought in, which is high density around transit-oriented areas. Basically, if you're within a couple hundred meters of a SkyTrain station, you got to build, I think it was minimum 18 stories. I can't remember the exact specifics around that, but it's basically a high density around high-speed transit rails, bus stops, things of that nature. And so the BC Conservatives actually fully aligned with what the NDP has brought out there. So they're okay with the high density around transit-oriented areas, but they want to also allow it to provide for grocery stores and small businesses within walking distance of the home. Now, the big one from the BC Conservative Party here is they want to repeal Bill 44. Bill 44 is what the NDP brought in around multi-unit housing, particularly duplex, triplex, fourplex. What they did is they took all of the land in British Columbia and they said, listen, all municipalities, we're going to strip you of zoning. Okay, we're going to say you must mandate duplex, triplex, fourplex on any lot that's greater than 3,000 square feet across BC. And so the Conservative Party basically wants to walk a lot of that back. Now, they've kind of been, this is from their official website, saying we will work with cities, not against them, to build the housing BC needs. Some municipalities support Bill 44, and we will continue to assist them in that implementation. But they're also saying that local governments need the flexibility to plan in ways that work best for their communities. AKA, they say, we think this might be better served to the municipalities. Maybe triplexes aren't a great product type for, Penticton, BC. Maybe they're great for Vancouver, where there's really high density. And again, you might agree with that, you might disagree with that. I think Bill 44 is good policy. I think it's needed. I think a lot of the bureaucracy that, listen, guys, the cost of land today, we're not building new single-family houses. This is not going to happen. Moving forward, you're going to have to continue to densify that land. And I think instead of having strictly just a city of towers, I think what we should have is have ground-oriented housing. And I do think that's, I think the duplex model in the city of Vancouver has actually worked tremendously well. There's huge uptake for it. And so this would actually walk back a lot of that. It would no longer really mandate the cities to put through multiplex housing. So on the rental construction side, they talk about bringing back the MERB tax incentive program, the multi-unit residential building, basically tax incentives to and create rental housing. This program was here in BC and in Canada between 1974 and 1982, and actually was the result of a record number of rental units ever built under construction during that period. Of course, the counter argument was, well, that was, these huge tax incentives that ultimately just benefited the rich. And yeah, but hey, listen, it benefited the rich. There needs to be a carrot and a stick. And while, it benefited the richest because you gave them favorable tax structures, what did they do? The incentive was they got favorable tax incentives, and so they went out and built rental housing and added to the supply of housing available, which ultimately keeps rents modest and prevents them from rising significantly. So I think that bringing back a program of this nature would be very, very beneficial. Again, they're going to have to work with the federal government, so implementation of it is never cut and dry. And so I would say this is really the bulk of the conservative housing platform. It is basically, we're okay with the high density around transit stations. We think that the multiplex zoning should really be at the discretion of the municipalities. So we're kind of wishy-washy on that. But ultimately is, hey, let's walk back the step code requirements here in BC. It's kind of, I'm going to be honest, it's more old school. It lacks a lot of punch, truthfully. I think it's a pretty modest, certainly not a progressive housing platform if you're very pro-supply. But again, you might not be pro-supply. You might be well-housed today, and you might not want multiplexes in your neighborhood. That's fine. This is probably the party for you. But in general, it is very much, hey, we got some ideas, we got some thoughts. We're willing to sort of step in where we need to, but ultimately, housing is predominantly community by community, and we feel that the municipality should largely be in control, and their constituents who vote for their municipal leaders should be dictating what supply is appropriate in their specific communities. And that's their view, that's the political view. But if you switch gears to the NDP, I've got some thoughts on. I think that they've done some tremendous work on zoning reform. They started the transit-oriented density, the high density around the transit station. They introduced the multiplex zoning, but they've also brought some things in that I don't like. And this is, again, for me politically, the whole frame of reference around speculators. It's the rich versus speculators, creating this class war. It doesn't sit well with me that we just frame that anyone that is out there, making money or building housing for profit is like a bad person. And, at the end of the day, housing gets built with capital. And that capital is 99% of the time private capital. It's people like me and you or institutions. It's money. Capital moves to where it is treated the best. And so if you continue to attack capital and demonize capital, it leaves. And so this is a really important reminder for the NDP, because again, I think they've done some really good job on zoning reform, but this anti-capitalist, this investment is what gets the housing built, right? So if you look on, let's go through the BC's platform again. We know what they've done. They've introduced zoning reforms. They've cracked down on, they've banned Airbnb basically across the province, more or less. They've introduced the speculation tax. They're actually promising to increase that. So they're promising to increase the speculation tax on not only local BC residents but foreigners as well. Keep in mind, from my experience, I've seen a ton. I think it's actually it was originally a tax that was brought in to target sort of satellite families, offshore people that weren't paying taxes here, like speculators. And then what it actually ended up doing is actually ended up hitting a lot of local people. Basically, if you owned a family cottage in Kelowna and that was your summer vacation, maybe it was in the family for 15, 20 years, well, chances are that home isn't utilized 6 months out of the year. So you actually a lot of people were actually caught up and hit with the speculation tax. So it actually became basically a wealth tax or a second homes tax, let's call it. It was a second homes tax. And so, that stuff doesn't really sit with me again. I think if someone's worked hard and has been able to own a second home, on the lake somewhere, yeah, great. That's awesome. That's your reward for working hard and probably being successful and creating jobs. And so that stuff doesn't sit well with me, but what they are trying to do is they are, again, if this is your view, they are going to crack down on housing speculators and flippers, which is basically if you flip your home within a year, you pay a tax. You flip your home within 2 years, you pay a tax. So a lot of taxation. They brought in a luxury homes tax, a luxury school tax, which is a function of a luxury homes tax. Again, they brought in the speculation tax, second homes tax. So it's really just about taking sort of from the haves and redistributing it to, let's call it, the have-nots. And so what they've done is they've also increased the tenancy laws in BC, in my opinion, to a point where the tenancy laws are now so heavily favored to the tenant side that it's actually scaring off a lot of mom and pop landlords. And I'm saying this because I see it on a day-to-day basis where people go, oh gosh, I had one bad experience, or I had a friend that had a bad experience. It was so hard to get rid of them. New tenancy laws, once you get them in there, you can't get them out, because now they increased the tenancy laws where if you want to occupy it for personal use, you got to live in it. You got to live in it for 12 months, right? So, and this kind of coincides with that second home speculation tax. It's like, well, you can't even really rent it out for 6 months of the year. You got to, once they're in there, they're in there. They don't have to leave. So what ends up happening is by having the tenancy laws skew in one favor, it actually disincentivizes people from renting out their homes. So the NDP basically tried to counter this and said, well, listen, we hear that people are concerned about renting out their homes because they're worried about someone that just squats and just stops paying their rent. So they actually created a rental slush fund, which is basically, hey, Mr. Landlord, if you stop paying, we will step in and cut the check for the tenant. We'll compensate you. But what I think that does is actually creates perverse behavior, which is like if I'm the tenant and I know that if I stop paying, that landlord is still going to be made whole by the BC government. It might make me think twice about maybe paying the rent. So I just, some of these policies, for every action there is a reaction. So that's one of those ones where you're left kind of scratching your head. They have started a new program where they're partnering with First Nations to build new housing, where they're going to subsidize 40% of the cost of the home for new buyers. So first-time home buyers that want to buy a home, the BC government will basically gift you 40% in a loan, and you don't have to pay that back for up to 25 years or until you sell. So again, a demand-side subsidy that I think actually is inflationary for home prices and I think distorts free markets. So what I'd say in summary on the BC NDP housing platform is this. I think that the zoning reform changes have been very good. I think they were needed. So a little bit different than what the Conservatives are doing, which they're kind of going to roll back some of that. So the NDP, I think, wins on the zoning reform changes. We do need to reduce the amount of bureaucracy around zoning, and we do need more homes to get built. They're not going to get built today anyways, because at the end of the day, we're in a recession and the numbers don't work and you can't sell the units. So if you can't sell the units, you can't build the housing. Well, housing starts are going to roll off either way. But I think as you get into the next real estate cycle, the next up market, these reforms will entice a lot of new supply to come to market. So the zoning stuff, I think, is tremendous. I think it's good. I think the changes they've made around, the speculator and going after the capital, increasing the tenancy laws to a point where they're so strict, you actually end up, and I'm telling you, this is happening. They are chasing capital out of the province. The NDP is now running the largest single deficit ever recorded. So that's ultimately going to come back through higher taxes. And those higher taxes will be levied against higher income earners. I think we already pay really high taxes in this province. So that concerns me from an economics perspective, from a person that likes finance and numbers. I look at this and say the Conservative side is the more fiscally responsible side. They're, again, a bit more old school. I don't agree with a lot of the reforms on zoning and going back kind of the way it was. But the NDP side is also like it's kind of like the complete opposite side, which is like, listen, we're going to take from the wealthy, we're going to redistribute it, we're going to free up zoning, so we're going to loosen that all up. And so yeah, I know if you liked your community, you've been there for 30 years, you better get used to multiplexes going in there. And so again, if you're established in a neighborhood, you're an older gentleman that's been there for 40 years, you might not like the NDP policies. So that's kind of my take on it. Again, guys, ultimately, I am somebody that, again, looks from the numbers. I think that if you can run a good economy, if you have a good economy, you're going to have wage growth, you're going to have productivity growth, you're going to have, because of that, you're probably going to have lower taxes. You're going to run a better economy. You can get that wage growth. And wage growth is one way to get affordable housing. If you run a good economy, there's two ways to get housing more affordable. Okay. One is to have supply sort of exceed demand, number one. And number two is to have wage growth exceed the growth in home prices. So I believe if you run a good economy, you should have wage growth. You should have economic prosperity, which propels people to build housing, right? If you feel good about the housing, if things are churning, running along, and everyone's doing quite well, like you'll get shovels in the ground, you'll get it built. And so I think if you run a good economy, a lot of things will take care of themselves. So that's kind of a lot of it is on my perspective on these political platforms. It's like, yeah, you can look at the housing platforms, but you also have to look at the economics behind it as well. And so I think that the NDP has done some very aggressive things. He's certainly not afraid to pull punches, Mr. David Eby. I think he's made a lot of progressive, ballsy moves, quite honestly. And I commend him for that. But at the same time, I don't necessarily agree with the redistribution and the attacks on capital, because I do worry that capital leaves the province. And when it leaves, it's hard to go back. Remember, capital is liquid. It goes to the path of least resistance. So keep that as mind as you head to the polls. Again, doing my best. I probably didn't get everything right here. Feel free to let me know in the comment section, but doing my best to at least explain to you guys on the housing side. So hopefully you can make an informed vote. I think it's incredibly important, and hope this video helped. I'll see you next week.